Picture this. It's the year 1429, and you're standing on a watchtower overlooking the Mediterranean. The sea looks calm until it doesn't. On the horizon, dark shapes begin to multiply. 17 massive ships. As they draw closer, you can make out the glint of armor and the movement of men. 18,000 soldiers are about to land on your island. Now here's the part that makes your stomach drop. The entire population of Malta, every farmer, every mother, every child, every elderly soul, adds up to barely 10,000 people. Let that sink in. The invading army doesn't just outnumber your fighting men. They outnumber your entire civilization, nearly 2 to 1. Even if every single person on the island, toddlers, grandmothers, the sick and the lame, picked up a stone and stood on the walls, you would still be outnumbered. This is the Siege of Malta in 1429, the only time in recorded history when a nation faced an army larger than its own census. And you? You're one of just 800 men standing between that tidal wave and the total extinction of your people. Before we step into this impossible fight for survival, if you enjoy uncovering forgotten chapters of history like this, hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment below. I want to know, would you have stayed to fight or tried to escape? I read every comment, and I'm curious where you'd stand in a moment like this. Now let's move. There's no time for slow introductions. Because the Hafsid army didn't wait. It's 1429. The Middle Ages are fading in much of Europe. But for Malta, the darkness is just beginning. This isn't the mighty fortress you associate with the Knights of St. John. That chapter hasn't happened yet. Malta is a neglected outpost of the Crown of Aragon, technically under Spanish rule. But the Aragonese are far away. No fleet, no garrison, no rescue coming. The island is poor, hungry, exposed, and across the sea lies the Hafsid Sultanate of North Africa, centered in modern-day Tunisia. They aren't coming for conquest alone. They're coming for revenge. For years, desperate Maltese sailors have survived as corsairs, raiding North African trade ships, seizing goods just to keep their families alive. In the central Mediterranean, they've become pirates out of necessity. Now the empire they preyed upon has come to collect. Leading the invasion is Qaid Ridvan, a commander known for speed, brutality, and efficiency. When his fleet strikes the southern beaches, there is no warning, no negotiation, no ceremonial declaration of war. The Hafsid soldiers hit the sand running. North African cavalry fan out across the countryside like a blade through wheat. In the southern villages, there's no organized defense. Farmers drop their tools. Families scatter. Some make it to carts. Some don't make it at all. Within hours, panic spreads like wildfire. A desperate human river begins flowing toward the center of the island. Everyone is running for Medina, the old hilltop capital, known grandly as the Città Notabile. It sounds impressive. In reality, in 1429, Medina is a crumbling relic. Its walls date back to Roman and Byzantine times, patched over with loose stone and hope. It was never meant to hold the entire population of the island. But within 48 hours, that's exactly what it's forced to do. 10,000 people cram into a space designed for a fraction of that number. The gates slam shut. The streets choke with livestock and crying children. Families sleep pressed against strangers. And as the sun sets, the horizon glows. Not from a peaceful sunset, but from villages burning below. The enemy outnumbers everyone inside those walls. The defenses are rotting, and there is nowhere left to run. To understand just how desperate this situation is, you have to look back 2 years earlier, to 1427. For generations, Malta had been treated like property. The Crown of Aragon had sold and resold the island to feudal lords like unwanted furniture. The Maltese were tired of being owned, so they did something extraordinary. They gathered every coin, every piece of jewelry, every sack of grain. As a people, they scraped together 30,000 Alphonsine florins and paid King Alfonso the Magnanimous for their freedom. They bought a charter guaranteeing they would remain part of the royal domain and never be sold again. They purchased their liberty. But it came at a devastating cost. They emptied their coffers. They melted church silver. They drained every reserve. So now, in 1429, as they stand on those crumbling walls looking out at 18,000 invaders, the irony is suffocating. They had spent everything to secure their freedom, and now they were too poor to defend it. No mercenaries, no new armor, no stockpile of gunpowder. They were free men and utterly destitute. Quaid Ridvan likely knew this. He understood weakness when he saw it. But instead of marching straight on Mdina, he made a different choice. He unleashed sorrow. Rather than giving the defenders a single focal point for their rage, he ordered his army to ravage the countryside. From the walls of Mdina, the Maltese were forced to watch their world burn. Jeytun, Birkirkara, Kormi. One by one, villages went up in flames. Crops meant to feed the island through winter were torched. Livestock were slaughtered. Wells were seized. It wasn't random destruction. It was systematic dismantling. Ridvan was stripping Malta of its life support. And then came the worst blow. The chronicles are chillingly specific. In the first days of the invasion, Hafsid raiders hunted through caves and valleys where civilians had hidden. They captured around 3,000 people. 3,000. These weren't soldiers. They were wives, children, parents. The families of the very men standing on the walls. Imagine being a defender on those ramparts. You see lines of prisoners in chains march toward the ships anchored at Marsak's Lock. You recognize faces. Maybe your brother, maybe your daughter. If you open the gates to save them, you doom everyone behind you. If you stay, you watch them disappear forever. That was the psychological trap Ridvan set. He desecrated sanctuaries, looted the Augustinian convent near Rabat, taunting the defenders to come out and fight on open ground, where his cavalry would annihilate them. He expected grief to shatter them. Instead, something else happened. Inside Mdina, the sorrow hardened into resolve. The local Dijmu commanders, noblemen who had remained on the island, made a pact. They would not open the gates, not for burning homes, not for captured kin. They would hold the capital, or die in its rubble. Ridvan realized the bait had failed. If he wanted Mdina, he would have to take it. So the countryside burned behind him as his army regrouped and turned its full attention to the hilltop fortress. The psychological warfare was over. Now the siege would begin. If you visit Mdina today, they call it the Silent City. Golden limestone streets, bougainvillea spilling over balconies, a place so peaceful you can hear your own footsteps echo. But erase that image. The Mdina of 1429 was not peaceful. It was a pressure cooker. When the 18,000 soldiers of the Hafsid army finished burning the countryside, they encircled the hilltop capital. And what they saw must have filled them with confidence. The mighty bastions you see today. They didn't exist yet. Those would come centuries later. In 1429, the walls were ancient, Roman foundations, Arab modifications, medieval patchwork repairs. The limestone was soft, eroded. In some places, gaps in the masonry were wide enough to slip a hand through. To the engineers of Qaid Ridvan's army, these weren't walls. They were a suggestion. But the real crisis wasn't the stone, it was the people. Remember the math. 10,000 civilians crammed into a city built for maybe 1,000 elites and their servants. The streets were packed shoulder to shoulder. Families slept in shifts on bare cobblestones, and they weren't alone. To deny the enemy food, farmers had driven their livestock inside the gates. Goats bleated in alleyways. Cattle stood tied near doorways. Chickens fluttered in courtyards already filled with refugees. The smell must have been unbearable. Sweat, smoke, animal waste, fear, disease began to spread almost immediately. And then there was water. Malta has no rivers, no lakes. It is a dry, rocky island. Ridvan knew this. Once his army encircled Medina, his first move was to seize and poison the freshwater springs around the hill. He assumed thirst would break them within days. But he missed something. Beneath Medina, hidden under centuries of stone, lay an ancient Roman system of cisterns, vast underground reservoirs carved into bedrock to capture rainwater. Over generations, they had been maintained and expanded. While the sun baked the limestone above, cool, stagnant water sat in darkness below. It wasn't fresh, it wasn't abundant, but it was enough. The defenders were literally drinking their own history to survive. Above ground, 800 men prepared for the storm. The Dejma militia, farmers, craftsmen, laborers, scrambled to reinforce the crumbling defenses. They had no cannons, no arquebuses, no gleaming suits of steel. Their artillery was piles of limestone rubble scavenged from ruined buildings inside the city. They dragged stones to the ramparts. They filled cauldrons, not with stew, but with oil and water to boil. Command fell to the Capitano della Verga, the captain of the rod, a local noble tasked with holding this chaos together. He had to be both general and jailer. Keep the enemy out. Keep panic in. Because if fear turned into riot over food or water, Medina would collapse without a single enemy climbing the walls. Then the drums began. From the ramparts, the defenders watched the Hafsid army settle in. Trenches were dug, ladders assembled. Siege towers rose slowly against the skyline like skeletal giants. The psychological torment was over. The bombardment was about to begin. It started not with a trumpet, but with a crash that shook the bedrock. Qaid Ridvan had brought the best siege technology North Africa could field at the time. Massive mangonels, trebuchets with counterweights capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds. From the walls, the Dejma watched the great arms swing. Then the sky fell. A boulder slammed into the Roman masonry with explosive force. Stone splintered. Dust erupted into choking clouds. Shards of limestone became deadly shrapnel, slicing through cotton tunics as easily as arrows. And arrows came next. Thousands of them. Hafsid archers moved into range and released volleys that darkened the sky. Chroniclers of medieval sieges describe the sound as a swarm of bees, followed by the wet, sickening thud of impact. For the 800 men on the wall, there was no safe posture. Stand to throw a stone, an arrow finds your chest. Crouch for cover. The enemy infantry advances closer to the gate. And here's where the numbers turned into torture. In a normal siege, defenders rotate shifts, some fighting, some resting, some eating. The Maltese couldn't afford that. All 800 men had to be on the walls at all times. If a single section was left thin, there was no reserve to plug the gap. So they fought without pause. When Hafsid infantry rushed forward with scaling ladders, they weren't met with cannon fire. They were met with gravity. The defenders stockpiled rubble. As ladders slammed against the walls, they pushed, shoved, and dumped limestone blocks down onto the climbers below, and the women of Medina played their part. While the men held spears and pikes, women and even older children ran bucket brigades under fire. They boiled oil, water, pitch, carrying heavy, sloshing cauldrons up narrow staircases, while arrows whistled overhead. When attackers clustered at the base of the wall, trying to undermine foundations, the defenders poured liquid fire down upon them. The screams must have echoed across the plains, but Ridvan didn't relent. He concentrated fire on the weakest sections. Over and over, trebuchets hammered the same spots. Cracks widened, gaps appeared. The Dejma had no masons to repair them, so they used whatever they had. At night, under cover of darkness, they rushed to breaches with timber, broken furniture, rubble, anything that could block a hole. They were holding the city together with debris and sheer will. By the third day of bombardment, exhaustion turned into hallucination. Hands were raw, voices hoarse, eyes bloodshot. Meanwhile, the Hafsid army rotated fresh troops forward. Then, suddenly, the siege engines stopped. A heavy silence fell. But it wasn't retreat. It was a breath. Down below, infantry formations tightened. Ladders were lifted. Drums began to beat in a slow, synchronized rhythm. The bombardment had softened the walls. Now came the human wave. The horn sounded, and the earth seemed to move. Thousands of Hafsid soldiers surged forward at once. From the ramparts, it must have looked like a living tide, steel and leather and dust rushing toward them. Ladders slammed against limestone. Grappling hooks bit into parapets. Then faces appeared over the edge. These weren't farmers. These were veteran warriors of the North African coast. Men hardened by tribal wars and desert raids. They wore chainmail, boiled leather, carried curved scimitars and round bucklers. They were faster, stronger, better fed. What followed wasn't elegant swordplay. It was chaos. On narrow battlements barely wide enough for two men to pass, fighting turned into grappling, stabbing, pushing. Bills and scythes, tools meant for harvesting grain, hooked enemy legs and yanked them backward. Exhausted Maltese farmers tackled armored soldiers with pure desperation, shoving ladders away and sending men crashing down onto rocks below. It was intimate, brutal, deafening. Steel clanged, men screamed, rocks thudded onto helmets, dust coated everyone in gray powder, making it hard to tell friend from foe. The Hafsids attacked multiple points at once. Main gate, damaged walls, rear defenses, stretching the 800 defenders thin as parchment. Near one gate, bodies piled so high they formed a grotesque ramp for the next wave. But the Dejma held, because behind them was everything. There was no second line. Every time a Maltese defender fell, a gap opened, terrifyingly wide, and somehow another stepped forward, sometimes even a woman seizing a fallen spear. As the sun dipped low, casting blood-red light across the walls, the assault continued. Ridvan fed men into the grinder. He could afford to lose 1,000. The Maltese couldn't afford to lose 10. When night finally fell, the fighting faded into scattered clashes in the dark. Eventually, the Hafsids pulled back, leaving broken ladders and broken bodies at the base of the walls. The Dejma had survived the first great assault, but as they looked around at their own dead, friends, neighbors, brothers, they understood a terrible truth. That had only been day one. and the enemy still had thousands left. There's a moment in every siege when adrenaline drains away and reality seeps in. For Medina, that moment came 3 days into the assault. The walls still stood. Barely. The Hafsids had been pushed back. But inside the city, the cost was becoming unbearable. Churches had turned into makeshift hospitals. Straw-covered floors were slick with blood. The wounded groaned in the dark, waiting for water that came by the cupful. The cisterns still held, but rations were shrinking, and whispers began to move through the packed streets. God has abandoned us. Outside the walls, Qaid Ridvan sensed it. Armies can smell weakness. He didn't need another complicated maneuver. He just needed one more push, one final surge over exhausted bodies. But what happened next doesn't fit neatly into military analysis. It lives in legend. Passed down through Maltese oral tradition for nearly 6 centuries, recorded in chronicles as the turning point of 1429. Whether you see it as divine intervention or the psychological breaking point of starving men, the effect was the same. During one of the fiercest assaults, when ladders once again crowded the parapets and defenders were buckling, a figure appeared. Not a peasant, not a noble, a rider on a white horse, sword blazing like fire, and beside him, according to the lore, rode Saint Agatha. To modern ears, it sounds like myth, but you have to understand the medieval Maltese mind. This island wasn't just Christian. It was bound to one story above all others. In the book of Acts, chapter 28, St. Paul was shipwrecked on Malta. He healed the sick here, preached here. For the people huddled inside Medina, St. Paul wasn't distant history. He was protector, patron, almost family. So when someone cried out, "St. Paul is with us," it was like lightning striking dry wood. Exhaustion turned into fury. Fear turned into ecstasy. Men who could barely lift stones moments before surged forward screaming with joy. They weren't defending property anymore. They were defending sacred ground, fighting under the gaze of their apostle. Did a white horse truly ride the walls? Or did desperation create a vision strong enough to ignite 800 dying men? In medieval warfare, it doesn't matter. Morale is everything. To the Hafsid soldiers pressing up ladders, something shifted. The defenders were no longer shrinking back. They were charging, laughing, crying, fighting like men who believed they could not die. And belief is contagious. Confusion rippled through the attackers. Rumors spread mid-battle, of spirits, of holy warriors, of something unnatural turning the tide. Fear spreads faster than steel. That day, the assault didn't just stall, it shattered. The Hafsids were driven back from the walls with ferocity that shocked even their commanders. By nightfall, Ridvan ordered a full withdrawal to camp. The walls of Medina were slick with blood, but they still stood. Inside his command tent, Ridvan wasn't thinking about saints. He was thinking about numbers. War, to a seasoned commander, is a calculation. He had come to Malta with 3 goals: punish the corsairs, seize captives, plunder the island. He had achieved 2. His ships were loaded with loot. Around 3,000 Maltese captives sat chained in holding pens, ready for the slave markets of Tunis. Only one objective remained: take Medina. And now he had to ask himself, was it worth it? The last assault had cost him hundreds of seasoned troops. Disease was beginning to creep into his camp. His own water supplies were tightening. If he lingered another week trying to starve out the city, dysentery might kill more men than swords. And what would he gain? A rocky hilltop town with no gold, inhabited by people who clearly preferred death to surrender. This is where real history parts ways with romance. There was no final duel, no heroic showdown between Ridvan and a Maltese champion. There was a decision. The cost of the rock now exceeded its value. So 3 days after the failed assault, the sentries on Mdina's walls saw something strange. Siege towers weren't advancing. They were being dismantled. Tents were coming down. Supplies packed. The Hafsid army wasn't fleeing in panic. It was withdrawing, orderly, disciplined. But before they left, they made sure Malta would remember. As the army marched back toward the coast, they scorched everything in their path. Olive groves, cut down, wells, poisoned, farmhouses, burned. It was calculated cruelty. If they couldn't have the island, they would ensure the survivors had nothing left to eat. Inside Mdina, relief and dread twisted together. When the final Hafsid galley disappeared over the horizon, the gates creaked open for the first time in weeks. The silent city was silent again, but it was the silence of a graveyard. Emaciated defenders stumbled into daylight, eyes squinting, bodies caked in grime. They had done the impossible. Against odds of more than 20 to 1, they had forced an empire to blink. But as they looked out across blackened fields and smoking ruins, celebration died in their throats. Because the army was gone. But something else was gone too. Families rushed to find loved ones, calling names, searching faces. For 3,000 of them, there was no answer. The Hafsid fleet had not sailed empty. Roughly a quarter of Malta's population had been taken. Think about that. Imagine erasing 1 in every 4 people you know. This wasn't just loss. It was amputation. These were the young men who would have rebuilt farms, the young women who would have borne the next generation, the craftsmen who knew how to shape stone and timber. In a single week, the Hafsids hadn't just burned the present. They had stolen the future. In the medieval world, captives could sometimes be ransomed. But remember the 30,000 florins. The Maltese had already emptied their coffers to buy their freedom from the crown of Aragon. There was nothing left. No silver, no reserves. They had purchased national liberty, but they could not afford the freedom of their own children. That wound never healed. A century later, when the Knights of St. John arrived in 1530, they described Malta as underpopulated, scarred, almost desolate. The ghost of 1429 lingered. The siege of 1429 was a tactical victory. The flag of Aragon still flew over Mdina, but demographically, economically, it was catastrophe, and something fundamental changed. The Maltese understood a hard truth. No fleet had come to save them. No pope had launched a crusade. Europe had watched from a distance. They survived, but they survived alone. That realization forged something new. Before 1429, they were subjects. After 1429, they were survivors. The fortifications of Mdina were repaired, not with royal gold, but with local sweat. The Dejma militia became more than obligation. It became identity, because they knew there would be a next time. And there was. Fast forward to 1565, the Great Siege of Malta. The Ottoman Empire arrives with an even greater force. The world remembers that siege, the cannons, the knights, the drama. But here's what's often overlooked. The men who held the walls when knights fell, they were Maltese militia, the great-grandsons of 1429. They carried stories of extinction and survival in their blood. They knew retreat was impossible. An invasion meant erasure. So in a way, the stand of 1429 didn't just save one generation. It bought time. If the gates of Mdina had opened in 1429, Malta might have become a permanent extension of North Africa. The Great Siege of 1565 might never have happened, because there would have been no Christian Malta left to besiege. This is why 1429 matters. It wasn't a clash of empires. It was a test of will. Ordinary people. No armor, no allies, no money, just crumbling walls and each other, and that was enough. Today, when you walk through Mdina's main gate, you pass under elegant stone arches. Tourists sip espresso. Cameras click as the sun sets over quiet ramparts. Few realize they're standing on ground soaked in desperation. If you listen closely, maybe you can still hear it. The clang of farming tools against steel. The prayers whispered over boiling oil. The silence of 3,000 souls carried away in chains. History loves kings and conquerors. But 1429 reminds us that sometimes history is written by farmers, by mothers carrying buckets under arrow fire, by fathers who refused to open a gate. They faced the mathematics of extinction and tore up the equation. They paid dearly, 30,000 florins, 3,000 lives, but they kept the rock. And sometimes, in the brutal arithmetic of survival, that is victory. So the next time the odds in your life look impossible, remember the 800 men of the Dejma. Remember that survival isn't always about being stronger. Sometimes it's about lasting one day longer than the storm. And that can change history.